everybody. My name is Patricia Lewis. I am the Research Director for International Security at Chatham House. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. We're going to be talking about how is new technology driving geopolitical relations. We're very fortunate in having three excellent speakers to get us going. Can I just say to people before we do that we are being live streamed, which means this is not under the Chatham House rules, so feel free to tweet as you like and take notes, etc. What we're going to do is we're going to turn to our three speakers and get them each to say a few words about the topic. I'm then going to kind of question them a little bit and get into a discussion. Then I'm going to go out to the floor. And at that point, I'd really appreciate if you made sure that your phones are turned to silent so that it doesn't interrupt proceedings, particularly if you wish to ask a question or make a point. So I'm going to start, first of all, with Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, who until earlier this year was a member of the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council and of the House of Lords Committee on Science and Technology. She chairs a working group of Digital Policy Alliance on Cybersecurity, and from 2015 to 2017, she chaired the advisory panel to the Bank of England on cybersecurity. 2010 to 2011, she was Minister of State in the Home Office, responsible for security and counter-terrorism, and a member of the newly created National Security Council. On stepping down and until March 2014, she was Prime Minister's Special Representative to Business for Cybersecurity, and she has a background in defence and foreign affairs, having been a career member of the diplomatic service for a while. She is, as you can see, one of our most amazing brains on international security, and particularly on cybersecurity. And we're really happy to have you here, Pauline. So why don't you get us started?
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. Rather terrifying build-up. Well, I think it's a rather fascinating subject, and made me reflect on the ways in which the world that I knew as a diplomat has changed. And it is the case, I think, that technology now is one of the drivers of international relations and will be an important element in the hierarchies of power in the world in the next in the rest of this century. I'm not going to talk specifically about different technologies. I know we will get into that. So I'm going to take technology in a sense as a generic thing. The accent obviously being on the data world. And I think the data world, and with both its potential and quite a lot of its implications, come to that in a minute, are really the foundation really for economic growth and wealth creation. Absent data, we would obviously go on creating wealth, but at a much slower pace than is going to be the case. And the digital world and the power of computing, which is accelerating all the time, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a moment, opens the door really to analytical capabilities which are not known to previous generations and which are at the root of both discovery and innovation and are really transformative in their nature. That in turn, of course, is going to drive a lot of policies at the governmental level, but also changes in society. It clearly becomes part of governmental educational priorities, and it becomes an element in, an important part of, the skills base of a community. Now, most bits of the planet can benefit from being the takers and users of modern technologies, but it is frankly the corporate inventors and innovators that create the wealth and enrich the societies in which they reside. And I think one of the potential big divides is between the makers of technology and the takers of technology. So one of the things that I think is probably already the case and is going quite likely to increase is disparities of wealth that are widening and will continue to widen both within and between societies. And that in itself creates, obviously, challenges of its own. Now, the applications of these technologies, have obviously the potential for profound social change, and I've just mentioned one. More broadly, I think it's true to say that in the Western democracies, there's been a redistribution of power in society that has already taken place, and I think will continue. If you think about it for a moment, the tech giants, and possibly the corporate sector generally, that's to say those parts of the corporate sector that actually survive the change in technologies, and there's quite chunks of the corporate sector that are actually not going to survive it. But those bits that are both leading and surviving it, on the whole, have gained power in relation to governments. And applications of technologies, I think particularly social media, but not only that, have actually increased the power of individual citizens. So as a general proposition, I think, in democracies, the power of the state has declined comparatively. I make a distinction there between the sort of ordinary governmental services and what people might think of as the secret state or the deep state, where, of course, government has resorted, and it could say so necessarily, actually to having to use powers to protect the collectivity, the security of the collectivity. And one of the issues, of course, is how you balance individual privacy and the security of the collectivity. It's one of the challenges that we're already familiar with and which is unresolved. Now, think for a moment and contrast that situation I've described with what's actually happening in authoritarian regimes, where on the whole you have absolutely the opposite process taking place. You have the concentration of power in the government, or in the state, or in the case of China, the party. And economic and political power is being accumulated and concentrated in the state via its possession of and its use of data. And in that situation, the companies are more interfered with, and the citizen is very much at the mercy of state power. A very different potential outcome. So you ask the question, or I ask myself the question, what's the likely outcome in this sort of world where you can see divergence taking place? Are we in for something, interstate relations, which are competitive and increasingly potentially adversarial? Or can we manage cooperation? And if so, how? I think at the moment, the way things are moving, the state is, this scene is being increasingly set, I think, for systemic competition, not the sort of military competition that we understood in the Cold War, or confrontation in the Cold War, though I think we shouldn't rule out sort of miscalculation of incidents. But it's much more, I think, to do with how we conduct our trade relations, the kind of rules that we lay down, in which, of course, the setting of standards is an important element. And there, I think, in that sort of world, power and influence is going to be sought via rival economic and technological investment in the countries which are leaders in this field, and also the networks of political and social influence that they succeed in creating through their economic capacities. A lot of this has to do with the third world, or the rest of the world. Who and what system and which elements actually succeed in capturing economies, and where you can, by the setting of standards, in a sense, get into a situation where you become a dominant supplier to a country. A new way, in sense of creating a great deal of influence and power. And the Belt and Road, I think, has implications of that kind, where countries become tied to as recipients of aid and help from donors. So I think at the moment the competitive aspects of technology seem to me to be on the rise. But it doesn't really have to be like this. And I think one of the challenges that we need to face is, can't we actually can't we make technology be an agent of cooperation? And if one begins to think for a moment of some of the challenges that we face, most particularly, I think, climate change, how do we do that without cooperation? How do we actually succeed in finding the solutions, succeed in mitigating a great challenge to the planet that we live on, if we don't succeed in cooperating over our use of technology? So my question to you, ladies and gentlemen, is which way is it likely to go?
Great. Thanks a lot, Pauline. That's a great question on which to end. Jamie Conliffe, we're lucky we've got two Jamies tonight. Jamie Conliffe is a business and technology journalist currently working for the New York Times and based in London. He's previously worked at MIT Technology Review, New Scientist, and Gizmodo. He holds an undergraduate degree and PhD in engineering science from the University of Oxford and has held lectureships at the University of Oxford and Imperial College London. Jamie, what have you got to say?
So I thought I would move on from what Pauline's had to discuss and try and think about a future where we move away from the kind of globalist mentality that has been the kind of like driving force behind the tech industry over the last few decades, and think about what it might be like if we head towards a more protectionist future. So I'm going to kind of draw on a few things that I've been reporting on over the past year and try and paint a picture, and we'll try and work out whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So I guess the kind of like, it's impossible to talk about this without thinking about US versus China, and I think the driving force behind all of what I'm about to talk about is the fact that China has risen as a tech power over the past few decades. But in more recent times, it's changing its approach, and it's moving away from kind of being a manufacturer of devices towards being a nation that wants to be technologically independent. You can see that a lot in the kind of Made in China 2025 initiative, kind of doubling down on AI, 5G, quantum computing, robotics. I think some of the progress being made in China is kind of often overstated in the media, but there's definitely like a genuine ambition there, and in some sectors it feels like those goals are realistic. And I'm thinking particularly about 5G and AI technologies like those. You can kind of see that in the wireless networks at the moment, right? So if you look back to 4G, China was kind of on the sidelines when it came to standard setting. If you now look at China's role in 5G, by some estimates, I think Chinese companies are going to account for about 40% of the IP that is used to set standards in the technology. So it's having a massive impact on the way that is kind of developed and rolled out. At the same time, you have the Trump administration in the US that's made no secret of the fact that it sees its own tech superiority as critical to its own national security. And we've seen a good demonstration back in May of what that looks like for companies getting in the way when the Trump administration effectively banned sale of American goods to Huawei and a tranche of other Chinese companies that were put on its entity list. Now, that's not really played out in the way that a lot of commentators thought it would do at the time. We kind of spoke quite a lot in the press about this being the start of a technological Cold War. Actually, what we've seen is grace periods by the US government, and now we're seeing waivers being issued. But it's definitely stoked fears of this split and this potential threat for bifurcation in the world of technology. And it's potentially reasonable to say that is doom-mongering, but from some of the people that I've spoken to, there is kind of a real and genuine fear that could happen. And I guess now I get to the point where I get to paint the picture of what that could look like. In reality, what does a bifurcated technological world look like? It's probably America using American technology, China using Chinese technology. But what we're really interested in tonight, I think, is what that looks like for third countries that are stuck in the middle and having to make very difficult choices. We've already seen the US applying huge amounts of pressure to countries to not use Chinese technology in, say, their 5G networks over security fears. But it's a bigger and more complex problem than just that, right? And so a huge driver of this is going to be cost, I think. If you look at, say, 5G as an example, Huawei is significantly cheaper than its rivals. So Ericsson and Nokia, I think some reports suggest that it's about 20% cheaper. And then, as we've already mentioned, if you think about China's project financing as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, it's going to become increasingly difficult for some poorer countries to not lean on China and go with Chinese technology. The problem there, as I see it, and I'm getting close to summing up, I guess, is this bifurcation, if it were to come about, basically represents a fork in the road. And there could or there could not be significant issues that are introduced by that. In the worst possible cases, we're going to head down a road where we see a lack of interoperability, right? And in that situation, that basically means that some countries are going to back one horse, some countries are going to back another horse. If you happen to back the wrong horse and your infrastructure is built out and it's not the successful infrastructure or it's not as competent and you're trying to innovate off the back of that infrastructure, that can seriously damage your economy. And so I guess the problem is that we really don't know which side might win out in that situation if it were to rear its head. So what does a protectionist tech sector look like for most countries? Actually incredibly complicated, incredibly risky, and like something we probably want to avoid, which I think is something that Jamie's going to talk about.
The other James.
The other James.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So now we turn to Jamie Saunders, who is a strategic security consultant and visiting professor at UCL, University College London, and a fellow of the James Martin School at the University of Oxford. James Saunders retired from the board of the UK National Crime Agency in 2017 after 29 years of public service with the NCA, the FCO, and GCHQ. Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. Yeah, I will focus on developing countries, but I did want to talk a bit about business as well and how this is impacting particularly international companies. And the reason to look at those two together is that they're both kind of caught in the crossfire of what is essentially a great power battle. And the reason that this matters is that they've got hard choices to make about which side they back, and we want to make our side as attractive as possible because we know we won't have the critical mass if we don't. And I was just going to draw out two pretty well recognized issues just to illustrate the point, and the first is around cybersecurity, which has had a lot of coverage recently, but I did also want to talk about data localization and some of the trends there. So if we start with cybersecurity, and if I look at the sort of the trends here, the use of offensive cyber capability by nation states has become normalized. 10 years ago when I started working on this, it was kind of out there, but it's now become normalized. And it's a bit worse than that because it's also proliferating. So there are more and more countries getting onto the game. Now, the reason why that's important for business is if you look at the Saudi Aramco attacks in, I think, 2012, the 2017 attack on the Petro Rabia petrochemical plant on the Red Sea in Saudi as well, and of course, WannaCry and NotPetya, what you have is poorly designed and executed attacks having an enormously destructive effect, almost certainly more destructive than the attackers actually intended. Now, whether this amounts to irresponsibility or incompetence or a mixture of the both is probably irrelevant. The bottom line is that it's businesses who find themselves in the front line when big states, big cyber powers start throwing their cyber weight around. Now, this is going to get worse as nation-state capability proliferates. There's a really interesting study, I think FireEye put this out, but Kaspersky were the original authors. There's a group called Machete that's based in Latin America, They were investigated by Kaspersky. They're attacking all sorts of countries, mostly in Latin America. It's very obviously native Spanish code. It's an indigenous capability, and no one is quite sure where it is. Is it Cuba? Is it Venezuela? No one really knows, but it's certainly Spanish-speaking. And I think it was last year that the Lebanese government was caught with its trousers down, using commercially available cyber capability to spy on various neighbours. Now, countries have a right to conduct espionage. I'm certainly not going to argue with that, but the point is that we cannot be confident that less sophisticated countries are going to have the kind of targeting processes and the controls around collateral damage which we'd expect to find in, say, the US or the UK. And then just to make matters worse, there's also the possibility and the reality of nation-state grade capability from the most advanced countries actually escaping into the wild, and the irony of eternal blue having been used in WannaCry and NotPetya has not been lost. So businesses and third countries basically do not feel that they are equipped to deal with this kind of nation-state level capability and this kind of level of proliferation. And I don't think there's any easy answers to that, but I do think that part of the long-term solution is to get some kind of accepted norms of responsible behavior on the part of states around things like proportionality, distinction, and looking at the risks of collateral damage. It feels a long way off, but I think that businesses and third countries should be piling on the pressure on more advanced governments to actually take this issue seriously. The second issue I was going to cover briefly was really about how governments and regulators are responding to this more dangerous cyber environment, but also responding to the ways in which digital technology is impacting on their sovereignty and their prosperity. And as I said, the main concern here is around data localization. There is a very interesting paper by the US trade representative, which I really recommend you read, which highlights some of the policies which are being put out there across the world. Now, some of the drivers of this are very legitimate. They're around privacy of citizens, they're around security of government and corporations, and Europe has tended to lead the way on this with GDPR, and most other countries are adopting something broadly similar. So I think one can salute that. But the second driver is actually more to do with national security and the needs of law enforcement, and the reality is that most countries, many countries at any rate, are forcing through data localization because they want to get at their citizens' data and their corporations' data. And they're frustrated with failure, what they see as failure, of the legal assistance regime as we've known it in law enforcement, and a resistance on the behalf of the US government and big US tech to let them get their hands on data which they think is legitimately theirs. And then the third driver is all around financial motivation. It's data localization seen as a way of encouraging inward investment, a way of benefiting national champions, and to be honest, a way of countering some of the sharp tax avoidance practices which a lot of big tech companies have been accused of. I'm not accusing them, that's not my role. Now, this has a massive impact on business because business has essentially assumed that the global IT infrastructure is a globalized service, that they can centralize data centers, support centers, security centers on a sort of round-the-clock 24/7 basis. But they can no longer do that because countries, individual countries, more and more of them are insisting on data localization. Now, that increases costs, but frankly, it makes some markets just totally uneconomic. And I think we will see some countries that force through data localization and find they can't actually attract the businesses that they need in the first place. The second risk for business is that the regulatory approach which governments and regulators are imposing, although they may be underpinned by the same objectives, are often widely divergent in terms of application, and there's very little by way of mutual recognition. one of the big banks was moaning at me about the fact they had to, I think, conduct 91 different CBEST tests, which are essentially intelligence-based penetration testing of their systems, because every single regulator that they work for insisted on their own and wouldn't accept the ones that were being done under the auspices of the Bank of England. So this diversity in regulation certainly leads to increased costs, and in some cases leads to hard choices about, well, whose regulation are you going to be non-compliant with? What I wanted just to close on was looking at developing countries, because this bifurcated technology environment, which Jamie has referred to, will lead countries to make hard choices about which side they are. And I agree with Jamie that the short-term imperative of low-cost infrastructure is likely to be more attractive than long-term considerations about participating in the Western digital economies. So we have to look at this issue from a developing country point of view and see what's going to make it attractive to them. And then finally, this more dangerous and contested cyber environment, they are very badly equipped for. And what we need to do is make sure, as we do all this wonderful ICT for development and we help them build their digital infrastructures, that we don't allow security to be an afterthought. And at the moment, it is an afterthought.
Thank you, Jamie. So, I mean, there's some threads running through this that I find really very interesting. And one of those is the issue of cybersecurity and availability and privacy and law, I think. And I guess Pauline talked about the balance between privacy and security. And I think part of the debate that's been going on in this country has been very much about how these can go hand in glove. Right. You know, how cybersecurity provides privacy, how encryption, how end-to-end encryption of messages, for example, provides the privacy that people need. But we also know in other countries that we are seeing that privacy being challenged. If you have some of these end-to-end encryption apps on your phone, that itself can be a reason to be picked up by the police, maybe questioned, interrogated, possibly even jailed in some places. So we're seeing a divide in that sense too. Jamie Saunders mentioned that in terms of the issue of how the law is interpreted. So is that going to be one of the big issues going through? How do we deal with the issues of, for example, encryption? That in our own country, we're having debates about that. Law enforcement would like to see that somewhat relaxed. And I would say perhaps our intelligence services are in favor of it because it builds trust in the internet. I mean, do you see these debates being carried on in other countries, or do you see them, in fact, really just not having an airing in the discussion because of this very heavy-handed government process?
I think a lot depends on capabilities. I mean, there are many countries in which this debate hardly exists because neither the state has the capabilities to intercept, interfere, and the individuals probably actually can have, because they're takers, they can have access to encryption. You don't get the same tension, though, because the state isn't capable of actually acting. That means that their citizens are obviously vulnerable to external interference, because they don't. A state that's not capable of interfering is also not capable really of protecting. These two functions actually go together. I mean, I think we resolve it here not by prohibiting encryption, but by the capabilities of the state and putting those capabilities of the state under fairly severe regulation. I mean, it used not to be the case that we would pass law that not only set out what the objective was and in a sense was output focused. We now pass law, and it's true in this area in particular, where we say, and this is the way you will do it, and you may not do it any other way. So we use process as a way of protecting the citizenry against abuse of power. And we introduce legal safeguards into the process of government, not as simply as a check against wrongdoing when it may have occurred, as a prevention thereof. That model, I think, which is already a different version of it available in the States, in sophisticated countries, will probably be a model that other democracies will follow. So there are ways of resolving this, but there will always, in the end, be, I think, a tension between where precisely you strike this balance between the rights of the individual and I think most people will regard it the duty of the state, to protect against the greater ills and dangers of life.
When you're not living in a country where the state protects its citizens, and maybe in a country where the state goes after its citizens, and then perhaps in that country, what you've got is cheaper technology with poorer cybersecurity, which may in the end not only increase the divisions, but also may not be supported for cybersecurity. What's going to happen in those situations?
I mean, that's fascinating. And I think, not to carry on coming back to Huawei as an example, but the idea that Huawei devices were for a period of time not going to receive Android updates, I guess, is a good example of that. So you might have a device that is out of date as soon as you've got it. I think that's a real and genuine concern, and one that could actually play out over the next few years. What that really means for those citizens is that I guess they are exposed to those kinds of attacks without even realizing that they're going to be, having first bought that device. It's kind of a terrifying situation.
That's in nobody's interest, right?
No.
Jamie,
Can I just back to this privacy and security thing? I mean, the first thing I should say is I thought we had an extensive and very high quality debate in this country with the IP Act, and I think most people would accept we came out with a kind of reasonable outcome. So I think we can be proud of that, but at the same time we've got to recognise that other countries have different historical and constitutional contexts and will come out in different places. And that creates kind of two challenges. One is these poor IT companies have got to operate in all these different ways, and that involves a lot of cost. It's very difficult for law enforcement because you've got slightly different standards and so on. But I think my biggest concern is back to this bifurcation point, because often if we're too shrill and we say, well, everyone's got to be identical to us, and that actually forces third countries who've got really deep-seated security concerns, it kind of forces them into the arms of Russia and China, to use the shorthand. So I think we need to be really, really careful. And while values might be universal, context and the sorts of security problems that countries have vary enormously. And I don't like singling out a country, but it seems to me India is such a bellwether here. It's got some very, very serious security problems, and in terms of community problems and tensions, and it will end up in a different place on the spectrum to where we are, and I think we need to respect what they're doing and not be too kind of hectoring.
And India in particular, of course, has Digital India. It's relying hugely on all of the digital technologies for its government services, for example. Everybody has to use them
so
in that way.
It also sells them too.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that most third world countries, if they stop and think about it a bit, will refuse to put their eggs in one basket only. I mean, they'll mix it.
Well, maybe that's a good strategy, like energy.
Depends slightly on the size of the
Can
country.
I just before we go out to the audience, just draw us a little bit away and say there are other technologies out there. There's all sorts of new biotech. There's new technologies in space. There's quantum technologies. There's AI. Now, all of these, of course, are being developed at pace in the industrialized world. some of these technologies might be very, very useful, and particularly I think of space technologies in the developing world. Are there leapfrog technologies? Do you see potential for countries to be able to jump over, a bit like with mobile phone technologies that we've seen in other parts of the world? Is there hope here for the developing world?
Yes, I mean, one of the features of our discussion is that we're painting a rather dystopian world.
Positive.
That's right. But when it comes to things like the biosciences, I mean, actually, that offers great hope for humankind. And I would have thought that's one of the areas where countries that, still have fairly low level of what we regard as public health do have an opportunity actually to make quite a leap forward, and skipping quite a lot of the stages that we've been through in order and be able to take advantage of some of those treatments and therapies which we can see now glimmering on the horizon. I don't think we're quite there, but in the next 20 years, I think there will be major advances. Yes, there are good things to be spread around as well.
Jamie, do you have something?
Cyber is now a mainstream issue. But I mean, Pauline, when we first met, it wasn't. You were one of the voices, really kind of pushing it. Now, this is a good thing that we're now having these debates, but it is quite late. And, quite a few trains have left the station. So I think when it does come to these other emerging technologies, we've got to do a better job at engaging the public and politicians and business at a much more earlier stage in the policy-making process.
And good regulation.
Yeah.
I mean, when you come think about the biosciences, the regulatory regimes are going to be crucial.
Great. Well, I'm going to go out to the audience, but before I do that, I have a confession to make. I made a major faux pas, and I forgot to mention that this whole event and the reception, most importantly, the reception upstairs, is being sponsored by DXC Technology, who have been organising and actively supporting these types of dialogues all over the world. So just wanted to thank them publicly for that. So thank you very much. I'm going to go out now to the floor. If you can raise your hand so that I might see you. And if you could just state your name and your affiliation if you have one. And there's quite a few being put up. So what I might do is I'll take one at a time for now, and then I might group them later. So if I could have for someone over here, and then someone there. Thank you.
Eleanor Bennett. So, what are the current most significant limitations to the response response of cyber attack on democracy?
So, I've been talking recently with countries who are now putting democracy as part of their critical infrastructure, or elections as part of their critical infrastructure, for example. So, seeing critical infrastructure not just being energy, transport, health, defense, now the whole concept of democracy is critical infrastructure, and cyber attacks on democracy, I think, is critical. I don't know, Jamie, whether this is something you've come across in your journalism.
Could you just repeat what your actual question was?
What are the current most significant limitations to cyber attacks
on democracy? The response to cyber attacks on democracy. And what can we do? What can be done about it? Essentially, yeah.
I mean, I think one of the most troubling issues that we're facing at the moment is the kind of misinformation campaigns that are waged on social media, right? And the fact that we actually have private companies that are kind of unwilling, seemingly, to do a great deal about it. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Don't worry about that. We're on the record. You're being live streamed, but don't worry about it.
So, I mean, Facebook this week, took down 4 misinformation campaigns, and that is quite a long way out from the 2020 elections, right? And they're only going to ramp up. There are clear issues that are unsolved because they're hard, they're difficult, they're technologically almost impossible to implement solutions for at the moment. That's the thing that worries me most, I suppose. And it's not clear to me what nation states can really do to affect that. And it's not clear to me what some of those companies are doing to even fix it.
Jamie?
Well, I think the fundamental limitation is about anonymity versus traceability. And it seems that anyone can say whatever they want in an election campaign as long as one's upfront about who you are. And I think it's too easy to pretend you're someone else. And I think the rules in some countries around the need to be upfront about who you are not being implemented in cyberspace in the way that they would be in, poster advertising and so on. So I think that ought to be fixable.
I mean, the other issue is how do you identify what's fake? What is information integrity? I mean, I think this is one of the most difficult things that we're having to face. Yeah. How can you be sure that the information that you're getting is the information that you were supposed to be getting?
I think data integrity is one of the increasing worries. If you ask me, well, what's on the worry list? I mean, data integrity is now pretty high, I think, for exactly that reason. Organisations not knowing what's on their system, and then you've got all sorts of other things which are part of this scene. I mean, government spends a great deal of time, trying actually to get people to improve their security. I mean, very simple stuff. The fact that you don't lays you open to attack. There's glitches in the software still, and no product liability. Organisations like say Facebook, not having enough moderation. It's no single thing. It's a whole clutch of issues, it seems to me, which lead to systems which are more open to abuse than they should be.
Data integrity is a word used a lot, but I think there is also the identity integrity, which isn't a great phrase, I accept that, but I think we have to tackle both. I mean, you can verify what is being said, but you can also verify who is saying it, if it is appropriate to do so, without saying anonymity is dead, which would be a terrible thing.
Hold them to account.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My question really is regarding, sorry, my name is Fataya Gela. I write for East African newspapers, the Horn Diplomat. I'm an analyst, so I look at financial technology and the impact it has on the people who are basically not bankable, who are not part of the financial system. Now, it has changed lives. We have money transfer companies now in East Africa who are pushing the boundaries. Now, in terms of, because it's regarding knowing your customer, and what happens is that's the backdoor to sort of illicit businesses and transactions and capital flow. So I'm looking at, for instance, terrorist group like Al-Shabaab, they're monetizing, the mobile banking in that region. So we live in an international world where there is no regulatory, there is no police or regulatory system that efficiently can look at this. So given the fact that you talked about protectionism and China, and we are moving into the next fourth industrial revolution, how do we, as emerging economies or developing economies, can safeguard against this data? So that's my question, really. Sorry.
Great question. So what can we do to help? What can be done is what you're asking, yeah.
What can be done to kind of provide...
The institutions, there's challenges, there's no
Can you get the microphone, sorry?
In that aspect. It's a weak institutions
that
are not equipped.
So we're talking about capacity building, we're talking
Absolutely.
about...
I mean, we don't have a fiscal monetary
building.
system. We don't have central banks that are effective or robust. So in terms of, some of these states are failed states, and they are just coming, out of, they're incapacitated, and they are dealing with a technology that's really driven.
So Joyce, I'm going to turn to you to answer this, because you, no, I'm going to be naughty. I'm going to turn to you and just, if you wouldn't mind taking the microphone to Joyce, because we've just come back from Addis Ababa, where we were with the African Union talking about capacity building in Africa. So why don't you just say a few words about that?
Okay. Well, I had a question, but I'll answer very briefly.
I'll come to you later with a question.
Yeah, well, on capacity building, I mean, this is a very big issue, and I think countries cannot agree on many things, but I think capacity building somehow is the low-hanging fruits that countries are saying, yeah, well, we need more capacity building. And I think some of the speakers have highlighted that. And I think it's really important, but also we need to think about what sort of capacity are we building and what sort of capacity these countries need. And I think more often than not, the approach has been in kind of like we go and just do what we think is best, and that doesn't work. And then you don't have buy-in, you don't have sustainability, and just, you're wasting your resources, you're wasting your time. So it's very important to engage. And this is one of the main things that we're talking about today. How do we engage developing countries in a better way? How do we make them part of this conversation? How do we offer them actually alternatives that they can choose from? And I think, Jamie, you talked about, both of you talked about, they offer this like low cost and they go for it. But what are the other alternatives that we're offering them? Not much, really. And what, so we talk about, the authoritarian model versus the open and free and secure, but we're not providing hard evidence as to how this open, free, and secure will contribute to economic growth, will help these countries achieve what they are looking for. So I think capacity building is absolutely, important, it's absolutely key, you're right. There are so many challenges, and I think, we can help by sort of like unpacking these challenges and think how we can enhance our approach.
Thanks, Joyce. So hold on to the microphone for your question, and then I'll turn to...
Capacity building often means institution building.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about know your client. Actually, know your bank. The client doesn't get very far if the bank is non-existent or corrupt. I think in today's world, to some extent, the people who are transferring money around the world depend upon the money laundering regulations of the better provided, and as we know, they are not all that robust themselves. So I think there's a very long way to go in actually providing secure, safe, and honest systems, let alone the third world, actually in other parts of the world as well. So it's an international challenge, I think, of a major order.
Jamie Saunders, no?
No, I was just going to echo that point, actually. I think there's a sense in which developing regulation and ways for third countries to think about these issues is great, but we need to make sure that we're regulating properly here as well. And that's something that we're demonstrably not doing a great job of necessarily at the moment. So I think it's a hugely important issue, but I think we're also need to make sure that we've got our own ducks in the row.
I would add in as well education, which, I mean, for this work, you need brains, right? You need a terminal, you need a connection, you need brains, and there's plenty of brains throughout the world. And that's the resource, I think, that we should be capitalizing on there. So I'm now going to give Joyce, oh, you don't want to ask a question? Okay. So I will take it, the gentleman over here.
So, a question. So, my name is Anthony Finkelstein. I am the Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security. So, I have, firstly, a very brief observation, which is that we've zoomed back to just data and digital again, and I really think the range of technologies and their geopolitical implications merits a little further poking. And I was fascinated by Pauline's distinction between makers and takers. And I wonder whether or not there might be, I'm quite interested in other people's reflections on that, and whether there may be a richer typology which we could develop. So makers, takers, shapers, exploiters, what else is there?
Great. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple together. There's somebody in the front row. A second from the... Yeah. Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Advaith Kumaraju. I'm a medical doctor. So I was just kind of going back to thinking about Pauline's point earlier when you mentioned that that technology has started to redistribute power. So it's given power back to the common man as such to try to organize and to sort of hold governments to account, etc. And some of this was seen with the 2011 Arab Spring, for example. But even within nation states, there's such a variation in, there's an inequality in terms of access to technology and the ability to use it and to organize oneself with it. Now, do you think that technological advances, particularly, for example, what the future of social media might be, poses a risk to a representative democracy, or do you think that it can be harnessed to promote it further?
Thank you. And one more question next to you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Giulio. I'm a postgraduate student at SOAS. My question is, in order to ensure growth and wealth, to what extent do you think government should veto foreign acquisition of prominent national companies? An example, for instance, here in the UK, back in 2014, DeepMind, which is a leading institution in artificial intelligence, was acquired by Alphabet, now Google. Thank you.
Thank you. So 3 meaty questions.
If I go first and I can choose which one to answer, can't I? Because I thought I was going to go to Anthony's, actually, because it seems to me that there are going to be quasi-monopolies around some of the underpinning infrastructure just because of scale, and certainly for IT and probably for a whole load of other technologies as well. And in a sense, I think we're going to have to live with that. But there was a term, I think it was Jonathan Zittrain at Harvard used around generative approaches, i.e. platforms that people can innovate on top of. And I think what worries me certainly about the way IT has gone, and other technologies could go the same, is that very narrowed walled garden approach, which means that if you're not the maker, you're incredibly constrained in terms of what you can do. So it seems to me we can't, we probably will have to have some big companies, and that this has been the US big tech's argument, but we need to, if necessary, through regulation or customer pressure, ensure that innovation can occur on top of that platform and that it's very widely spread.
How does language work with that? Because we do have an issue, I think, with language, right? We have an awful lot of this being done essentially within the English language. Perhaps quite a lot now being done within various Chinese languages, certainly in the written Mandarin. But what about other languages? How much of a barrier is that to entry in terms of innovation?
Well, I mean, it can be in a very obvious way that if you're not speaking in native English, then your market is going to be limited if it's a sort of a higher value a service. I don't know what the answer to how to deal with that is. I was struck, and this was again a few years ago, by the Nigerian Minister for Telecommunications speaking, I think it was the Stockholm Internet Forum event, about, look, actually no one gives a damn about Facebook because we've got our own Me Too or something, I've forgotten what it was called, but they had their own social media and everyone wanted to use that rather than the sort of US one. But I think that's dead now. I think the sort of Facebook monolith, if you like, has blown the competition out of the water. So I think there has to be some way that, and I mean, social media is a great example. I'm not trying to answer the other question, but it seems to have been done in a very walled garden type way. It doesn't support interoperability. And yet if one could somehow enforce greater interoperability, then I think you'd have more innovation in the same way that the MS-DOS platform was very open in a way that Apple wasn't in the early days. I'm probably not being very coherent on this, but it seems we got to do technology in a way that is generative and not walled garden.
Just thinking about the social media and walled garden point, I think what is quite interesting is if you look at China, that did have a walled garden for its social media because it had a walled garden for its internet, right? It has created social media sites that are now becoming pervasive internationally. If you look at something like TikTok, which has kind of like exploded forward and is now kind of a global phenomenon. And I think the situation in some other countries is that they have just allowed monoliths like Facebook and Google to kind of enter and be the dominant force, whereas they could have maybe walled off. But it's potentially now just too late for that. So
Do you want to answer the other question?
I was going to say, I'll take the question about what role government should play in. The question was, what role should governments play in letting domestic companies being acquired by foreign entities, right? So you gave the example of DeepMind and Google, and I guess we've seen the same thing with ARM and SoftBank. There's a sense in which the UK has been incredibly liberal about it. If you look across to the US, I mean, the US has recently especially been incredibly aggressive about not allowing it, right? There's probably a happy balance somewhere in the middle, and I'm not sure where that balance lies. It doesn't feel like a purely liberal approach is particularly useful for the UK at the moment, nor does it really feel like the kind of aggressive approach of the US is particularly useful from a global technological perspective, I would argue. So the short answer to your question is I'm not sure, but I think there is some happy medium in there.
Pauline, do you want to address any of these?
Well, on that very interesting question, it's an active issue in government, is what should foreign buyers be allowed to purchase? One question, who is the buyer? Is it a state or is it a private entity? That issue probably matters. We're used, I think, to having export controls. The old problem used to be what you allowed the enemy to have of yours. Now it's a question of what are you going to allow a questionable organization or country to have, which is actually situated at home. And that's becoming just as much of a burning issue as any export control. The UK has taken the view that this is a national security matter. Therefore, Japan's a friendly country, okay, SoftBank. The United States a friendly country, okay, DeepMind. Question, however, to what extent, do you over time, can you really say that the source of your wealth creation is not actually in the end also a matter of your ultimate security? To what extent is national security both composed of the security element and the prosperity element? And the UK increasingly is joining these two agenda. So the question is going to arise, how far you actually allow foreign ownership of key technologies for the future. I don't think a traditional national security solution or argument actually is sufficient consideration. So I'm quite critical of what I regard as too relaxed a view in this country of what we need to be careful about safeguarding. You can, however, very easily fall into a protectionist mode, and I don't think that does us any good either. So this is quite a tricky issue. Anthony, your question about can there be exploiters? Yes, you're quite right to say there's things between makers and takers, and indeed I would say Europeans have on the whole been exploiters. That's exactly what we have done. We've taken technologies that actually much more developed elsewhere and actually turned them into something useful. And a lot of those things are devices. So I think that is an absolutely fair point. On the business of social media and democracy, I think all these technologies can be used for good and bad. And it's a question of how you actually allow them to develop. So the answer to your question is it can certainly enhance democracy. And indeed, a very key part, as you pointed out, of what happened, say, in Egypt. At the same time, you can also use it, of course, to trap your population. And as I think increasingly in China with their walled garden. And one of the issues, down the line is which of these models is more resilient? Are people going to put up being in a walled garden all the time, or will there at some point be an explosion? Explosions are not unknown in Chinese history. I wouldn't suggest they're going to happen early or soon, but it is an issue. How far you can actually, in a society that increasingly depends upon the use of the educated mind, Can you actually tell them they're not allowed to think certain things, they're not allowed to do certain things, they're not allowed free inquiry? I think that is a challenge.
We've reached 7 o'clock, but I've got a number of people who've been trying to catch my eye for a while. I've got someone here, Josh, and then someone over there, and I will take one more there as well. David, yes. So, and what I can ask you to be very quick, and then I'm going to get like 3-word answers from each of the panelists and end. So, please.
Josh Arnold Forster. I used to work for Labour Party on defence issues. And thank you very much. Fascinating debate, and I agree totally that we should look at other technologies as well as cyber ones. But the cyber one I'm interested in is, we've seen Facebook recently say, well, we're doing all this great stuff on disinformation. How do you feel Facebook and indeed other tech giants would feel about if they do all of that work and then they have a regulator, an empowered regulator that could supervise this, that could look at it just like the Broadcasting Standards Council, or in a similar way?
Okay, quicker than that, please, David.
David Nardell, I'm an independent cybersecurity consultant. The latest with China is that last month they passed a new law that basically says that all data in the country, including data belonging to foreign industrial companies, high-tech companies, whatever, is transparent to China, basically to national security. So anything that's developed by foreign companies is going to be stolen by China. How do you see this working out in terms of geopolitical relations?
Great. And last question.
Fred Casella, Exponential View podcast. In a world where essentially tech has decoupled national prosperity from national politics, so you have China becoming very prosperous and not being democratic, and in a world where the West has shown itself to be protectionist and unreliable at best, in the battle for ideas and influence, what has the West got to offer the world over and above not being China?
Okay, thank you very much. So very quick responses, please. And if you can't respond, don't. I'm going to go to you first, Jamie C.
Not necessarily a lot, I think, to answer your question. I think the kind of, this is more than 3 words, sorry. This idea that America promises greater security than China seems problematic, I think. I think for a lot of developing countries, they might think that America is just as capable of spying on them as China is. To answer that question, obviously, also, badly.
Pauline.
Well, I think in relation to China, what we're increasingly going to be demanding is level playing field. I think it's going to be a big, theme of relations. On not being China, well, I think actually not being China is still quite an asset. What we need to do is sell ourselves better. We need better packages. We need to offer something that actually looks appealing, because that's what China does. She presents a package. We need to start packaging our goodies, and not have, this is our aid, and here are our human rights agenda. You need to put the thing together and say, and we'll help you with the capabilities. And there's a way of doing it which will be a lot more skillful than the one we use at the moment.
Jeremy.
Listen more.
Listen more. We're going to end on listen more. And thank you for listening and participating, and thank our panelists. Thank you so much.